Waitress whispered, "This key belonged to my mom." Millionaire collapsed in shock. "Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today?" The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner with the persistence of a debt collector, each drop carrying the weight of secrets that had been buried for 23 years. Inside, beneath the flickering neon sign that spelled "Open" in broken pink letters, Marcus Wellington sat in a corner booth, his Armani suit looking absurdly out of place among the cracked vinyl seats and coffee-stained Formica tables. His manicured fingers drummed against the scratched surface as he observed the evening crowd, construction workers grabbing late dinners, night shift nurses stealing moments of normalcy, and elderly patrons who treated this place like their second home. Marcus had built an empire worth $3 billion by reading people, by understanding their weaknesses, their desires, their breaking points. Wellington Industries didn't just construct buildings, it constructed opportunities, leveraging human nature to create profit margins that would make Wall Street wolves weep with envy. Tonight, however, he wasn't here as a predator. He was here as something far more dangerous, a man conducting an experiment on the human soul. The young waitress approached his table with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to armor herself with pleasantries. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her name tag read Sarah, and her uniform, a powder blue dress that had seen better decades, hung loose on her thin frame. There was something about her movements, careful and economical, that spoke of someone who had learned to make every gesture count. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, already reaching for the pot she balanced effortlessly despite its obvious weight. Marcus studied her with the intensity of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. "Please. And perhaps you could help me with something else." Sarah's smile faltered slightly, the wariness of a woman who had heard too many requests from men in expensive suits. But she maintained her professional composure, refilling his cup with steady hands. "What can I do for you?" From his jacket pocket, Marcus withdrew a small, tarnished silver key. It was old, probably from the 1970s, with intricate engravings that time had worn smooth. He placed it on the table between them, watching Sarah's reaction with predatory focus. "I found this in my father's belongings after he passed. I'm trying to understand what it opens." The change in Sarah was immediate and devastating. The color drained from her face as if someone had pulled a plug, and her hand moved involuntarily to her throat, where Marcus now noticed a thin silver chain disappearing beneath her collar. The coffee pot trembled in her grip, and for a moment he thought she might drop it entirely. I'm sorry for your loss," she managed, but her voice had taken on a hollow quality, as if it were traveling from a great distance. Her eyes remained fixed on the key, with a mixture of recognition and something that looked remarkably like terror. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the gentle tone he reserved for his most delicate negotiations. "You recognize it, don't you?" Sarah's breathing had become shallow, rapid. She set the coffee pot down on the table with exaggerated care and took a step back. "I should get back to my other tables, Sarah." The way he said her name stopped her cold, not because it was threatening, but because it was kind. The sort of kindness that came from understanding, from shared pain. "I think we need to talk." But before she could respond, the bell above the diner's door chimed, and a man in his 50s entered, shaking rain from an expensive overcoat. He had the look of someone accustomed to authority, steel grey hair, sharp suit, and eyes that catalogued everything they saw. Marcus recognized him immediately. James Patterson, the district attorney, a man whose political ambitions were as transparent as they were ruthless. Patterson's gaze swept the diner before settling on Marcus with obvious surprise. "Wellington, what brings you to this establishment?" "Just grabbing some coffee, James. The rain caught me." Marcus's response was casual, but his attention remained partially focused on Sarah, who had gone very still behind the counter, her back turned to them both. Patterson slid uninvited into the booth opposite Marcus, his movements carrying the confidence of someone who had never been refused anything. Convenient timing. I've been meaning to call you about the Harbour District project. The city's ready to move forward with the eminent domain proceedings. Marcus finally turned his full attention to Patterson, and something in his expression made the district attorney shift uncomfortably. Eminent domain. For which properties exactly? The usual suspects. Some run-down apartments, a few small businesses that aren't profitable anyway, nothing that can't be. Relocated. Patterson's smile had the warmth of a shark's. The city needs revenue, Marcus. Your development will bring in millions in tax dollars. And the families who live in those run-down apartments, what becomes of them? Patterson waved dismissively. The city has relocation assistance programs. They'll find somewhere else. These people are adaptable. They have to be. Marcus found himself looking past Patterson toward Sarah, who was now cleaning tables with mechanical precision, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. These people, he repeated slowly. You mean citizens, James? People with lives, histories, connections to their community. Of course, I just meant. Patterson seemed to realize he was treading on unstable ground. Look, Marcus, this is business. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. The greater good. Marcus had heard that phrase countless times in boardrooms and political offices, had used it himself to justify decisions that prioritized profit over people. But sitting here in Murphy's diner, watching Sarah's careful movements, feeling the weight of the mysterious key in his pocket, those words felt hollow, even obscene. Tell me about Murphy's diner, James. Is this one of the properties earmarked for demolition? Patterson glanced around with barely concealed distaste. This old place? Of course. It's been bleeding money for years. The owner can't keep up with maintenance, let alone health code violations. Honestly, we'd be doing the community a favor by tearing it down. And the employees? What happens to them? They'll find other work. There are always restaurants looking for waitresses. Patterson's tone suggested he found Marcus's concern both puzzling and mildly irritating. Why are you asking? Are you... Before Marcus could respond, a crash from the kitchen drew their attention. Sarah had dropped a tray of dishes, and she stood frozen among the shattered ceramic, her face pale with what looked like panic. The elderly cook, a man with arms like tree trunks and gentle eyes, emerged from behind the grill. Sarah, honey, you okay? You've been jumpy as a cat all evening. She knelt to collect the broken pieces, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, Eddie. I'll pay for the dishes. Don't you worry about that. Go take a break, get some air. Marcus watched as Sarah hurried toward the back exit, and something in her desperate flight triggered a memory that had been buried for decades. His father's office, late at night, hushed phone conversations that stopped whenever young Marcus appeared. Whispered mentions of a woman named Catherine, tears in his father's eyes that he'd never seen before or since. I need to go, Marcus said abruptly, standing from the booth. Patterson looked up in surprise. We haven't finished discussing the Harbour District project. No, we haven't. But I think I need to understand a few things before we proceed. Marcus dropped $100 bill on the table, far more than his coffee cost, and headed for the back exit. The alley behind Murphy's diner was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt, bordered by brick walls tagged with decades of graffiti. Sarah stood beneath a single flickering streetlight, smoking a cigarette with the desperate intensity of someone trying to burn through more than tobacco. She looked up as Marcus emerged from the diner, and her expression cycled through fear, resignation, and something that might have been relief. You followed me. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I did. Marcus approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "Sarah, I need to know about the key." She took a long drag from her cigarette, the ember casting brief shadows across her face. "My mother gave me this before she died." Her free hand moved to her throat, where she pulled out a thin silver chain. Hanging from it was another key, identical to the one Marcus carried. She said it was from someone she loved, someone she couldn't be with but never forgot. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Marcus reached into his pocket and withdrew his father's key, holding it up to the streetlight. The two keys were unmistakably a matched set, both bearing the same intricate engravings, both worn smooth by decades of handling. "What was your mother's name?" "Catherine Morrison." The name hung in the air between them like a bridge across 23 years of silence. "She never married. I was born in 1998. Marcus did the math with the precision of a man accustomed to calculating risk. 1998. His father had been 45 then, married to Marcus's mother, but increasingly distant, increasingly prone to long business trips and unexplained absences. The timing aligned with his own birth year of 1985, making him 13 years older than the young woman standing before him. "Catherine Morrison," he repeated, the name awakening memories he'd thought were lost. "She worked for Wellington Industries, didn't she? In the accounting department." Sarah's cigarette trembled between her fingers. "She never told me much about her work. Just that she'd been in love with someone who couldn't choose her, someone with responsibilities she couldn't understand until she was older." Marcus leaned against the brick wall, feeling the weight of revelation settling over him like a physical burden. His father, the man he'd idolized and eventually surpassed in business acumen, had lived a double life, had loved someone he couldn't publicly acknowledge, had fathered a child he could never claim. "She died 2 years ago," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cancer." She held on to that key until the very end, said it represented the only real love she'd ever known. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all Marcus had. "She was. Your mother was a good woman?" A smile ghosted across Sarah's face, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her all evening. "The best. She worked 2 jobs to put me through high school, never complained, never made me feel like I was a burden. Even when she was dying, she worried more about me than herself." Marcus found himself studying Sarah's features with new attention. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see traces of his father in her bone structure, the same determined set of her jaw, the same storm-grey eyes. She was his half-sister, this young woman struggling to survive in a world that seemed determined to push her down. "Sarah, the diner, Patterson mentioned it's scheduled for demolition. Is that true?" Her laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. 6 months from now, the city says we're a health hazard, but everyone knows it's about money. They want to build another shopping complex, bring in chain restaurants instead of places where real people can afford to eat. And you'll lose your job. I'll lose everything. This place has been my second home since Mom got sick. Eddie's been like a father to me. The regulars are my family. I've got nowhere else to go, no savings, no prospects. She dropped her cigarette and crushed it under her heel with more force than necessary. But I guess that doesn't matter to people like you, right? We're just collateral damage in someone else's success story. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow, partly because it was true, and partly because it came from someone whose existence had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about his family. "Sarah, Look, I don't know why you really came here tonight, and I don't know what game you're playing with that key, but I've got tables to clear and bills to pay, so if you'll excuse me." She started toward the back door, but Marcus's voice stopped her. "Wellington Industries is the company backing the Harbor District development." Sarah froze, her hand on the door handle. Slowly, she turned back to face him, and the expression in her eyes was like watching someone's world-view crumble in real time. Wellington. As in Marcus Wellington? The billionaire? That would be me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of implications neither was quite ready to voice. A siren wailed in the distance, and somewhere above them, a window opened and closed. The city continued its restless existence, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in a forgotten alley. "You're going to destroy my life for profit," Sarah said finally, her voice hollow with understanding. "You came here tonight to what? Scout the territory. See how the peasants live before you bulldoze our homes." "No." The denial came quickly, forcefully. "I came here because I've been questioning things lately. Questioning whether the choices I've made align with the man I want to be." "And what kind of man is that?" It was a fair question, and one Marcus realized he'd been avoiding for years. What kind of man was he? The kind who built empires while ignoring the human cost. The kind who inherited his father's business acumen but not his capacity for love. The kind who would unknowingly destroy his half-sister's life in pursuit of another profitable quarter. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm hoping to find out." Sarah studied his face in the dim streetlight, searching for deception or manipulation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, still wary, but tinged with something that might have been curiosity. "The keys. What do they open?" Marcus had been wondering the same thing. Two matching keys, kept by lovers who couldn't be together, preserved for decades, by a woman who died clutching one, while the other lay forgotten in a dead man's belongings. "I think that's what we need to find out." The next morning brought the kind of crisp October air that made New York City feel alive with possibility. Marcus stood in the lobby of Wellington Industries headquarters, a 60-story monument to ambition and achievement, watching streams of employees flow through the marble-clad space like blood through arteries. He'd built this empire through careful calculation, strategic ruthlessness, and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. Today, for the first time in his adult life, those principles felt insufficient. His assistant, Margaret, approached with her usual efficient stride. At 55, she'd been with the company for over 2 decades and possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that made her indispensable. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington. The Harbour District Planning Committee is scheduled for 10, and the Mayor's office called about the environmental impact reports. Cancel the committee meeting." Margaret's professional composure never wavered, but Marcus caught the slight widening of her eyes. "Certainly, sir. Should I reschedule for later this week?" "Indefinitely." Marcus started toward the executive elevators, then paused. "Margaret, I need you to pull some old files for me. Personnel records from the late 1990s. I'm looking for an employee named Catherine Morrison." "That might take some time. Files from that era are archived off-site. Make it a priority." The elevator carried him to the 60th floor, where his office commanded panoramic views of the city he'd helped reshape. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Manhattan's sprawl, from the gleaming towers of Midtown to the gentrifying neighborhoods of Brooklyn. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably starting another shift at Murphy's Diner, serving coffee to people who couldn't afford to eat anywhere else. Marcus settled behind his desk, a massive piece of Brazilian rosewood that had cost more than most people earned in a year, and opened his laptop. The Harbour District project file contained hundreds of documents, architectural plans, financial projections, environmental assessments, and legal briefs. Buried in the middle was a list of properties scheduled for acquisition through eminent domain. Murphy's Diner occupied a corner lot on Hudson Street, a modest building constructed in 1952 that had served as a neighborhood anchor for 7 decades. The city's appraisal valued it at $340,000. a fraction of what the land would be worth once development began. The family that owned it, the Kowalskis, had inherited the business from the original Murphy and had been running it at break-even for the past 5 years. Marcus pulled up demographic data for the surrounding area. The average household income was $32,000 per year, well below the city median. Most residents were long-term tenants in rent-stabilized apartments, elderly people on fixed incomes, and working families who couldn't afford to live anywhere else in Manhattan. The development would displace approximately 2,400 people to make room for luxury condominiums and high-end retail. His phone buzzed with a text from Patterson. "Committee meeting cancelled. We need to move forward with the timeline. City council vote is next month." Marcus set the phone aside without responding and continued reviewing files. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became with what he found. Environmental assessments had been fast-tracked. Community input sessions had been scheduled at times when working people couldn't attend. Opposition from residents' groups had been dismissed as not economically viable. It was all legal, all by the book, all perfectly orchestrated to achieve the desired outcome with minimum resistance. It was also, Marcus was beginning to understand, morally bankrupt. His computer chimed with an email from Margaret. "Found the Catherine Morrison file. We'll bring it up in 10 minutes. While he waited, Marcus found himself thinking about his father, trying to reconcile the man he'd known with the one who'd kept a secret love affair for years. Robert Wellington had been a formidable businessman, demanding and exacting, but also capable of unexpected kindness. Marcus remembered times when his father would quietly pay employees' medical bills or help with children's college tuition, always with instructions that the assistants remain confidential. Margaret knocked and entered, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. "The Catherine Morrison file, sir. She worked in accounting from 1995 to 2000. Marcus accepted the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady. Inside were employment records, performance evaluations, and a photograph that made his breath catch in his throat. Catherine Morrison had been beautiful in a quiet way, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that looked remarkably like Sarah's. Her performance reviews were exemplary, with notes about her attention to detail and discretion handling sensitive financial information. The final document in the file was a resignation letter dated March 15, 2000. It was brief and professional, citing personal circumstances as the reason for leaving. But clipped to the back was a handwritten note that made Marcus's hands shake as he read it. "Robert, I can't continue this way. I love you too much to keep pretending that what we have is enough. Our daughter deserves better than secrets and stolen moments. I hope someday you'll find a way to be part of her life, but I understand if you can't. The key you gave me will always remind me of what we shared. Please don't try to find us. Catherine, our daughter." Marcus read the words 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated. Sarah wasn't just his half-sister. She was a daughter his father had known about, but had chosen to abandon. The keys weren't just romantic tokens. They were symbols of a family torn apart by circumstances and choices. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Wellington, there's a Ms. Sarah Morrison here to see you. She says it's about the Harbor District project." Marcus's heart rate spiked. "Send her up." The minutes until Sarah's arrival felt like hours. Marcus paced his office, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to understand what her visit meant. When his assistant showed her in, he was struck by how small she looked in the vast space, how her simple jeans and sweater contrasted with the corporate opulence surrounding them. But her posture was straight, her chin raised, and her eyes held a determination that reminded him powerfully of his father. She carried a large manila envelope and wore the keys around her neck openly now, as if she'd decided to stop hiding who she was. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice formal but steady. "Please, sit down." Marcus gestured to the leather chairs arranged around a coffee table near the windows. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I think I've served enough coffee for one lifetime." They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent to their personal drama, while decades of secrets hung heavy in the air between them. "I spent all night thinking about what you told me," Sarah began. "About the keys, about my mother, about who you are. I did some research." She opened the envelope and withdrew a stack of printouts, newspaper articles, financial reports, and what appeared to be property records. Wellington Industries. 50 years of transforming urban landscapes, but I found some interesting patterns in your transformations. Marcus leaned forward despite himself. What kind of patterns? Low-income neighborhoods that get completely erased, families who get displaced and never find comparable housing elsewhere, small businesses that close and never reopen. She spread the papers across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "You've done this before, Marcus, many times." The accusation hung in the air, undeniable, because it was true. Marcus had overseen dozens of developments that followed the same playbook. Identify undervalued areas, leverage political connections to fast-track approvals, displace existing communities, and build for wealthy buyers. It was profitable, efficient, and legal. It was also devastating to people like Sarah. "You're right," he said simply. "I've built my career on projects like Harbour District. I justified it by telling myself that development brings jobs, increases tax revenue, improves city infrastructure. And the people who get pushed out? What about them? I told myself they'd be better off elsewhere, that they'd find new communities, new opportunities." Marcus looked out at the city below, seeing it with different eyes. "I convinced myself that progress requires sacrifice, and that sacrifice was theirs to make." Sarah followed his gaze to the window. "My mother used to clean office buildings like this one. She'd come home exhausted, her hands raw from chemicals, and tell me stories about the people in the fancy offices. She never spoke badly of them, even when they treated her like she was invisible. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. She also kept a diary. Sarah reached into her envelope again and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "She wrote about you, Marcus, about your father, about choices and consequences and the weight of loving someone you can't have." Marcus's throat tightened. What did she say? Sarah opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. May 12th, 1999. "Sarah took her first steps today. I wish Robert could have seen her, could have been here to share this moment. She has his eyes, his stubborn streak. I wonder what kind of man she'll choose to love, whether she'll be braver than I was, stronger than I was. I hope she never has to choose between her heart and her security the way I did." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His father had missed his daughter's first steps, her first words, every milestone that defined a child's early life. All for what? To maintain appearances, to protect a reputation, to preserve a marriage that, if Marcus was honest, had never seemed particularly happy. "There's more," Sarah continued, flipping pages. July 4th, 2000. "Independence Day feels ironic. I left Robert's company today. Took Sarah away from the only father figure she might have known. But I couldn't keep pretending that stolen hours and hidden love affairs were enough for either of us. The key he gave me was supposed to represent a future together, but I think we both knew that future was impossible." "The keys," Marcus said suddenly. "Do you know what they open?" Sarah shook her head. "Mom never told me. She just said they were important, that they represented something beautiful that couldn't last." Marcus stood and walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting of the New York harbor. He entered the combination, Sarah's birth date, he realized with a start, and withdrew several items: property deeds, insurance documents, and an old wooden box he'd inherited from his father, but never opened. The box was mahogany, with brass corners and a small keyhole in the center. Marcus had always assumed it contained business documents or financial records. Now, looking at it with Sarah watching, he understood its true purpose. "May I?" he asked, holding up his key. Sarah nodded and removed her own key from around her neck. Together they knelt beside the coffee table. The keyholes were positioned so that both keys needed to be turned simultaneously, a mechanism that required two people, two hearts, acting in unison. The locks clicked softly, and the box opened to reveal contents that neither of them had expected. Inside were dozens of photographs, pictures of Catherine holding a baby Sarah, shots of Sarah's first birthday party, school photos, and candid moments that could only have been taken by someone who loved them both deeply. Beneath the photographs were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Sarah but never sent. Marcus picked up one dated on her 5th birthday. "My dearest Sarah, today you turn 5 years old, and I wish more than anything that I could be there to celebrate with you. Your mother tells me you're learning to read, that you love stories about dragons and princesses. I've enclosed a book I hope you'll enjoy someday, when you're old enough to understand that sometimes the most important love stories are the ones we can't tell publicly." Sarah was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she read letter after letter from the father she'd never known, but who had clearly known and loved her. Marcus found his own eyes burning as he discovered a side of his father he'd never imagined, vulnerable, regretful, but deeply caring. At the bottom of the box was a legal document that made them both stop breathing. It was a trust fund established in Sarah's name in 1998 and funded regularly until Robert Wellington's death. The current value was over $2 million. "He left me money," Sarah whispered. Marcus examined the document more carefully. "Not just money. He left you a legacy. This trust was designed to provide for your education, your future, your security. But there was a condition. It could only be accessed when both keys were present, when you learned the truth about your parentage. Why didn't Mom ever tell me? Maybe she didn't know. Or maybe she was protecting you from the pain of having a father who couldn't publicly acknowledge you." Marcus set the document aside and looked at his half-sister with new understanding. "Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss." She looked up from the photographs, still clutching a picture of herself as a toddler. "The Harbor District project. I'm going to kill it. You can't do that. Ooh. Not because of me, not because of guilt or family obligations or whatever this is." Sarah's response surprised him with its vehemence. "Your investors, your reputation, your business partnerships will survive, or they won't, and I'll build something better." Marcus stood and walked back to the window, looking out at the city with new eyes. "Do you know what the mortality rate is for small businesses displaced by development projects like mine?" Sarah shook her head. 87% fail within 2 years of being forced to relocate. 87%. That means Murphy's Diner, which has served its community for 70 years, will almost certainly die if I proceed with this project. And the families in those rent-stabilized apartments. Studies show that 60% never find comparable housing in their price range. They end up moving farther from jobs, schools, support networks. Their children's educational outcomes suffer. Their health outcomes suffer. Sometimes their families break apart under the stress. Marcus turned back to face Sarah, and she saw something in his expression that looked like resolve, crystallizing. "I've spent my career treating these statistics as acceptable losses, collateral damage in the name of progress. But progress for whom? For people who already have more than enough? For shareholders who measure success only in quarterly profits? What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to try something different. Something that honors our father's memory and your mother's sacrifice. Something that proves development doesn't have to mean displacement. Sarah stood and joined him at the window, and for a moment they looked like what they were. Siblings, united by blood and circumstance, contemplating a shared future neither had imagined possible. What did you have in mind? Marcus smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt genuine. I want you to help me redesign the Harbour District project, not as a typical development that erases existing communities, but as something that preserves and enhances them. Mixed-income housing that includes affordable units for current residents. Commercial spaces reserved for local businesses at below-market rents. Community facilities that serve neighborhood needs rather than outside interests. You're talking about giving up millions in profits. I'm talking about making millions of dollars in a way that doesn't destroy lives. Marcus pulled up architectural plans on his computer screen. It's possible, Sarah. Difficult, less profitable in the short term, but possible, and more importantly, it's right. Sarah studied the plans with the careful attention of someone whose life had been shaped by other people's business decisions. Murphy's Diner gets a new location in the development, rent-free for the first 5 years, with a long-term lease that protects against future displacement. And the families in those apartments? Get first priority for the affordable units in the new development at rents comparable to what they're paying now. It was ambitious, idealistic, and probably financially reckless. It was also, Marcus realized, the first business decision in years that felt aligned with his conscience rather than his bank account. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. Why was he upending his business model, potentially alienating his investors, and risking his reputation for people he'd never met? The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and profound. Because I want to be worthy of the man our father was trying to become when he loved your mother. Because I want to honor the sacrifice she made to protect you, and because I've spent too many years building things that make me rich, but don't make me proud. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been a struggling waitress, facing homelessness when her workplace was demolished. Today, she was the beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar trust fund and the half-sister of one of New York's most powerful developers. There's a catch, isn't there? She finally said. Marcus nodded. I need you to help me understand the community I'm trying to serve. I need someone who knows what it's like to struggle, to face displacement, to worry about where the rent money will come from. I need someone who can tell me when my good intentions are missing the mark. You want to hire me? I want to make you a partner. In the Harbour District project specifically, but potentially in others as well. Marcus gestured toward the trust fund document. You have the financial resources now to be an investor, not just an employee. I want to create a new model for development, one that includes community voices from the beginning, not as an afterthought. The offer was staggering in its implications. Sarah Morrison, who had been serving coffee for tips 12 hours earlier, was being invited to become a developer, to shape the future of her own neighborhood and others like it. I don't know anything about real estate development. You know about people. You know about community. You know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of decisions made in rooms like this. Marcus gestured around his luxurious office. That knowledge is more valuable than all the MBA degrees and financial models in the world. Sarah walked back to the coffee table and picked up one of the photographs from the box, her mother holding her as an infant, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. What would Mom think about all this? I think she'd be proud. I think she'd be amazed by the strong, principled woman she raised. And I think she'd want you to use this opportunity to help other families avoid the choices she had to make. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the community room of the Harbor District Community Center, facing an audience of 200 residents who had every reason to distrust him. The room buzzed with skeptical energy, families who had faced displacement before, elderly residents on fixed incomes, small business owners who had seen their neighbors bulldozed for profit. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress that managed to look both professional and approachable. In the 3 weeks since their revelation, they had worked 18-hour days, redesigning the Harbor District project from the ground up. It had been exhausting, sometimes frustrating, and completely transformative. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the packed room. "My name is Marcus Wellington, and I'm here to talk about the Harbor District Development Project." A murmur of hostility rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "Here comes the bulldozer!" Marcus waited for the noise to die down. 3 weeks ago, I would have stood here and told you about the economic benefits of development, about increased property values and improved infrastructure. I would have used phrases like urban renewal and community enhancement to describe a project that would have displaced most of you. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Marcus held up his hand. "I'm not here to give that speech. I'm here to apologize for planning to give it and to ask for your help in creating something different." That got their attention. The room fell silent, waiting. "I want to show you something," Marcus continued, gesturing toward a large screen that had been set up at the front of the room. The first slide showed architectural renderings of the original Harbor District project, gleaming towers of glass and steel that looked nothing like the neighborhood around them. This was our original plan. Luxury condominiums starting at $800,000, high-end retail spaces, a hotel catering to tourists and business travelers. It would have been profitable, modern, and completely disconnected from the community that already exists here. He clicked to the next slide, showing the revised plans he and Sarah had developed. The buildings were lower, more varied in design, with materials and colors that complemented the existing neighborhood character. This is what we're proposing now. Mixed-income housing with 40% of units reserved for families earning less than $60,000 per year. Ground-floor commercial spaces reserved for local businesses, with rent stabilization clauses that prevent future displacement. A community health clinic, a childcare center, green spaces designed by residents for residents. An elderly woman in the third row raised her hand. "What's the catch?" "Nobody gives away money like that without expecting something back," Marcus smiled. "The catch is that it's less profitable in the short term. My investors aren't thrilled. Some of my business partners think I've lost my mind. But the return on investment isn't just financial, it's social, environmental, and moral." A man in work clothes stood up near the back. "I'm Joe Kowalski. My family owns Murphy's Diner. You're telling me you're not going to tear down my place?" "Not only are we not tearing it down, Mr. Kowalski, we're offering you a prime location in the new development. Rent-free for 5 years, then below market rates, with a 20-year lease that includes protection against future displacement." Joe's wife, Maria, stood beside him, tears in her eyes. "Murphy's has been in our family for 30 years. We thought we'd lost everything." Sarah rose from her seat and turned to face the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I was a waitress at Murphy's, facing unemployment when this project went forward. I know what it feels like to worry about rent money, to wonder if you'll have to leave the only community you've ever known." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I also recently learned that I'm Marcus Wellington's half-sister, and that our father left me a trust fund I never knew existed. I could take that money and disappear, start over somewhere else. Instead, I've chosen to invest it in this community, in this project because I believe we can prove that development doesn't have to mean displacement." The revelation rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Sarah Morrison, one of their own, was not just advocating for the project. She was funding it, shaping it, ensuring it served their needs rather than exploiting them. An older black woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes stood up. "I'm Dorothy Washington. I've lived in this neighborhood for 47 years, seen it change, seen promises broken, seen families torn apart by people who call displacement progress. Why should we trust you?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading and expecting. Why should people who had been betrayed before trust someone whose wealth came from the very system that had oppressed them? "Mrs. Washington, you shouldn't trust me based on my words alone. You should judge me by my actions." Marcus clicked to another slide showing a detailed timeline. "Over the next 6 months, we're implementing what we call a community-first development process. No major decisions get made without community input. Every family currently living in the development area gets a binding guarantee of comparable housing at current rent levels. Every local business gets first right of refusal on commercial spaces. And if you change your mind, if you decide this community-first approach is too expensive or too complicated..." Dorothy's question cut to the heart of the matter. Sarah spoke up again. "Then I use my inheritance to buy the entire project from Wellington Industries and continue it as a community land trust. The neighborhood gets permanent protection from future gentrification." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Sarah's offer was more than a safety net. It was a guarantee that the community's interests would be protected regardless of corporate decisions or market pressures. A young mother with a toddler on her hip raised her hand. "What about the construction period? My kids can't breathe dust for 2 years, and I can't afford to move twice." Marcus nodded. "Phased construction with temporary relocation assistance. Families stay in the neighborhood during construction. In temporary housing we provide at no cost. Children remain in their current schools. No one gets displaced during the building process." An elderly man with a walker made his way slowly to his feet. "I'm Eddie Restrepo. I've been cooking at Murphy's for 20 years. Sarah's like a daughter to me." He looked directly at Marcus. "You hurt her, you hurt this community, and we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." The threat was delivered with grandfatherly kindness, but its sincerity was unmistakable. Marcus found himself oddly moved by the protective solidarity these people felt for Sarah, and by extension, their willingness to hold him accountable for his promises. "I understand, Mr. Restrepo, and I welcome that accountability. In fact, I'm proposing that we formalize it." Marcus clicked to the final slide of his presentation. "Community Oversight Board, with binding veto power over design changes, rent increases, and tenant selection. Sarah serves as community advocate with full access to financial records and decision-making processes. Quarterly public meetings with mandatory attendance from all project partners." The room fell silent as people processed the implications. Marcus was offering them something unprecedented in development projects. Real power, ongoing control, genuine partnership rather than token consultation. Dorothy Washington stood again. "Mr. Wellington, if this works, if you actually do what you're promising, this could be a model for other neighborhoods, other cities." "That's exactly what we're hoping, Mrs. Washington. We want to prove that profitable development and community preservation aren't mutually exclusive. We want to show other developers that there's a better way to build." A voice from the back called out, "What about Patterson? The DA's been pushing this project hard. What's he going to say when you change everything?" Marcus's expression hardened slightly. James Patterson represented everything wrong with the old model of development. Political power used to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the vulnerable. Mr. Patterson and I are going to have a very frank conversation about the difference between public service and public exploitation. That conversation took place 2 days later in Patterson's office, a wood-paneled monument to political ambition decorated with photographs of the district attorney shaking hands with mayors, governors, and business leaders. Patterson sat behind an imposing desk, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and calculation as Marcus explained the revised Harbour District proposal. "You've lost your mind," Patterson said finally. "Do you have any idea how much political capital I've invested in this project? How many promises I've made to city council members, union leaders, campaign donors? I have some idea, yes, and I'm prepared to help you find a way to fulfill those promises without destroying a community in the process." Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of a predator reassessing its prey. "This is about that waitress, isn't it? The one who was at the diner that night. What is she to you?" "She's someone who opened my eyes to the human cost of the way I've been doing business." "How much is she costing you?" "This revised project has to be cutting your profits by what, 30%, 40%? Marcus felt a familiar anger rising, the same rage he'd experienced as a child when schoolyard bullies picked on smaller kids. "James, let me be very clear about something. Sarah Morrison is my business partner and the beneficiary of a family trust worth more than your annual salary. She's also someone who understands this community in ways that neither of us ever could. If you continue to speak about her disrespectfully, this conversation is over." Patterson's eyes widened slightly. He'd clearly underestimated both Sarah's importance and Marcus's commitment to the revised project. "Your business partner?" "Marcus, she's a waitress from a dive diner. She's a community advocate with a $2 million investment capacity and more integrity than most of the people in your political circle." Marcus leaned forward. "The question is whether you want to be part of a project that actually serves the public interest, or whether you want to be remembered as the district attorney who tried to bulldoze poor families for developer profits." The threat was implicit but clear. Marcus had enough influence to make Patterson's political future very uncomfortable if the DA chose to oppose the revised project. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating the political ramifications of various choices. "The city council vote is in 3 weeks. I can't guarantee support for a completely different project." "Oh, then we'll have to convince them that this version better serves their constituents." Marcus stood to leave. "James, you have a choice here. You can be part of something that proves government can work for all citizens, not just the wealthy ones. Or you can continue being part of the problem." "Liz." After Marcus left, Patterson sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline and considering his options. His political career had been built on carefully calculated alliances with business interests, trading policy support for campaign contributions and future opportunities. The original Harbour District project had been a perfect example. Wealthy developers got prime real estate, the city got tax revenue, and Patterson got credit for bringing investment to his district. But Marcus Wellington's revised proposal complicated everything. If it succeeded, it would demonstrate that development could benefit existing communities rather than displacing them. Other communities would demand similar protections. Other developers would be pressured to follow Wellington's example. The cozy relationship between political power and corporate profit would face uncomfortable scrutiny. On the other hand, opposing Wellington Industries carried its own risks. Marcus had resources, influence, and now a compelling narrative about social responsibility that could make Patterson look greedy and callous by comparison. The district attorney made his decision with the calculating pragmatism that had defined his career. If he couldn't stop Wellington's project, he would claim credit for it. The city council meeting 3 weeks later drew an overflow crowd to the marble-lined chambers of City Hall. Residents from the harbour district filled every seat, with dozens more standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Marcus and Sarah sat at the presenters' table, flanked by architects, community advocates and legal advisors. Council President Maria Santos called the meeting to order and recognized Patterson, who rose with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Members of the council, I want to begin by acknowledging that the original Harbour District proposal required significant revision to better serve our community's needs. Patterson's tone suggested he had personally championed these revisions rather than reluctantly accepting them. After extensive consultation with residents and careful review of the social impact data, I'm proud to support Wellington Industries' innovative approach to inclusive development. Sarah caught Marcus's eye and suppressed a smile. Patterson's political survival instincts were impressive, even if his moral consistency left something to be desired. Marcus rose to present the revised proposal, speaking not from prepared remarks, but from the heart about lessons learned, communities preserved, and the possibility of development that strengthened rather than scattered existing social bonds. He spoke about his father's hidden love affair, about Sarah's mother's sacrifice, about the keys that had unlocked not just a wooden box, but a new understanding of what business success could mean. When he finished, Council President Santos opened the floor for public comment. One by one, Harbour District residents rose to speak, some expressing cautious optimism, others sharing fears based on past betrayals, all demanding accountability for the promises being made. Dorothy Washington was among the last to speak. I've seen a lot of politicians and developers make pretty speeches about community benefits, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of broken promises. But I've never seen someone put their own money where their mouth is the way Ms. Morrison has done. I've never seen a developer agree to community oversight with real teeth. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. Mr. Wellington, you say you want to prove that development can strengthen communities instead of destroying them. We're going to hold you to that, not just for the next few months, but for the next few decades. This isn't just about buildings, it's about whether powerful people can learn to use their power responsibly. The council vote was unanimous in favour of the revised Harbour District proposal, but Marcus felt no sense of triumph as he left City Hall. Victory would be measured not in political approvals, but in families who remained housed, businesses that survived and thrived, and a community that grew stronger rather than weaker through the process of change. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the construction trailer that served as the Harbour District project headquarters, reviewing progress reports with Sarah and their team of architects, contractors, and community liaisons. The first phase of construction was ahead of schedule and under budget, thanks partly to innovative construction techniques and partly to community members who had volunteered skilled labour in exchange for guaranteed employment on the project. Murphy's Diner had been carefully dismantled and was being rebuilt in the new development's main plaza, with Eddie supervising every detail to ensure that the new space preserved the character and community feeling of the original. The Kowalskis had used the transition period to update their menu and train additional staff, preparing to serve a larger and more diverse customer base. The community health clinic is scheduled to open next month, Sarah reported, consulting her tablet. Dr. Martinez from the Neighborhood Association has agreed to serve as medical director, and we've got commitments from 3 other physicians to provide part-time services. Marcus nodded, checking the item off his own list. What about the childcare center? Fully enrolled with a waiting list, Mrs. Washington is serving as director. Turns out she retired from 30 years of teaching elementary school. The parents' cooperative is working better than we hoped. The success of the community-owned facilities was one of the project's most encouraging developments. Rather than simply providing services, the development was creating opportunities for residents to participate in their own community's economic development. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and her expression shifted as she read it. "Marcus, you need to see this." She handed him the phone, which displayed a news alert. Wellington Harbor District model adopted by Chicago Development Project. The article described how another developer, inspired by Wellington Industries' approach, was implementing similar community-first principles in a troubled Chicago neighborhood. "This is what Mrs. Washington meant," Sarah said, "about proving that powerful people can use their power responsibly. We're not just changing one neighborhood, we're changing how development gets done." Marcus felt a complex mix of pride and responsibility. Success brought its own pressures, its own expectations for future projects and broader social impact. But it also brought something he'd never experienced in his business career, the satisfaction of work that aligned with his values rather than conflicting with them. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious. "The trust fund." Marcus looked up from the progress reports. In the excitement of the development project, they'd barely addressed the personal implications of their father's legacy and the money he'd left for Sarah. "I've been thinking about it a lot," she said. $2 million is more money than I ever imagined having. It's financial security for the rest of my life, the ability to buy a house, to travel, to never worry about rent or medical bills or any of the things that have defined my existence up until now. "But," Sarah smiled, "but I keep thinking about something my mother wrote in her diary. She said the key represented something beautiful that couldn't last. I think she was wrong about that." She stood and walked to the trailer's window, looking out at the construction site where the first new buildings were beginning to rise. The key didn't represent something that couldn't last. It represented something that could last, but only if we were brave enough to make it last. Dad and Mom couldn't find a way to be together, but we can find a way to honor what they meant to each other. "What are you proposing?" "I want to use the trust fund to establish a foundation, the Morrison Wellington Foundation for Community Development. We use the money to replicate this model in other cities, to train developers in community-first approaches, to provide seed funding for projects that prioritize people over profits." Marcus stared at his half-sister with something approaching awe. She was proposing to give away a fortune that could have guaranteed her personal security in order to extend security to other communities facing similar threats. "Sarah, that's an extraordinary gesture. But are you sure? This money could change your entire life. It already has changed my life. 6 months ago, I was serving coffee and facing homelessness. Today, I'm a community developer with the knowledge and connections to keep doing this work for the rest of my career." She turned back to face him. "Besides, what good is financial security if I'm the only one who has it? What good is escaping poverty if I don't help other people escape it too?" The foundation they established became a model for community-controlled development across the country. Within 3 years, Morrison Wellington projects were underway in Detroit, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Oakland, each adapted to local conditions, but sharing the same core principles of community input, affordable housing preservation, and economic opportunity for existing residents. Marcus found that his role had evolved from developer to teacher, traveling to universities and professional conferences to speak about the business case for social responsibility. Sarah became a nationally recognized advocate for community land trusts and tenant protections, testifying before Congress and advising mayors on inclusive development policies. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. The Harbour District had become not just a business success, but a genuine community, with Murphy's Diner serving as its unofficial town hall. Marcus had dinner there twice a week, often joined by residents who had become friends rather than merely beneficiaries of his largesse. On a warm evening in late September, exactly 2 years after the night he'd first met Sarah, Marcus sat in his usual booth at the new Murphy's location. The diner buzzed with conversation, families enjoying dinner, teenagers doing homework, elderly residents playing cards and sharing neighborhood gossip. Sarah approached with a coffee pot and the easy smile of someone who had found her place in the world. "Regular or decaf tonight?" "Regular. I'm going to need the caffeine. The Portland project meeting runs until midnight." She poured his coffee and slid into the booth across from him, a ritual they'd developed for checking in with each other about both business and personal matters. "How are you feeling about Portland?" Marcus considered the question. The Portland project was their most ambitious yet, a former industrial site that would house over 1,000 families, with community ownership of commercial spaces and renewable energy systems designed by local engineering students. Nervous, excited, hopeful. That's a good combination for this kind of work. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the life of the community unfold around them. Near the window, Dorothy Washington was teaching a young girl to play chess. At the counter, Eddie was explaining his recipe for apple pie to a customer who turned out to be a food blogger documenting community restaurants. "Do you ever wonder what Dad and Mom would think of all this?" Sarah asked. Marcus had wondered about that many times. Would his father be proud of the son who had chosen community service over maximum profit? Would Catherine Morrison be amazed by the daughter who had used inherited wealth to fight the very system that had forced their separation? "I think they'd be surprised," he said finally. "I think they'd be proud, and I think they'd be relieved that their love story had a happy ending after all." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's not an ending, Marcus. It's a beginning." Outside Murphy's Diner, the Harbour District hummed with evening activity. Children played in the pocket park that had been designed by community meetings and built with neighborhood labor. Elderly residents sat on benches, watching the world go by and sharing stories with whoever stopped to listen. Young families walked to and from the community center, where evening classes offered everything from English language instruction to computer programming. It wasn't perfect. No community ever was. There were still disagreements about building designs, complaints about construction noise, and ongoing tensions between longtime residents and newcomers attracted by the development's reputation. But it was real, it was thriving, and it was proof that development could strengthen rather than scatter the bonds that made neighborhoods into communities. As Marcus walked home through streets he had helped design, but that belonged to the people who lived there, he thought about the keys that had started this entire journey. They had unlocked more than a wooden box. They had unlocked a different way of understanding success, family, and the responsibility that came with power and privilege. The keys now hung in a place of honor in the community center, displayed alongside photographs documenting the Harbour District's transformation and letters from other communities seeking to replicate their model. But Marcus carried their lesson with him everywhere, that love, properly channeled, could indeed last, that secrets once revealed could become foundations for justice, and that the most valuable inheritance anyone could leave was not money or property, but the courage to choose compassion over profit, community over isolation, and hope over fear. In the end, the waitress who whispered, "This key belonged to my mom," had unlocked not just a family mystery, but a new understanding of what it meant to build something worthy of the love that had made it possible. And in a city that often seemed to value only wealth and power, that understanding was perhaps the most revolutionary development of all. We finished the first part here. Comment if you want part 2.